a man whose dignity refused to be erased, whose voice would not be silenced by fear. His story is not just one of survival. It is a cautionary tale for an age where fame makes one both idol and target. In the end, Cliff Richard did not just reclaim his name. He defended a principle, stood firm in the eye of a storm, and reminded the world that no reputation, no matter how noble, is safe from suspicion unless we learn to separate headlines from truth. And for that, he earned not just sympathy, but a renewed respect. Because surviving fame is hard, but surviving betrayal while keeping your soul intact is something only the strongest among us can do. Now, in his mid-80s, Sir Cliff Richard leads a life that many would describe as both enviable and inspiring. Despite time marching on, Cliff remains very active, splitting his time between his homes in Barbados and Portugal while keeping ties to the UK. His Barbados estate, known as Coral Sundown, is a 6-bedroom house with a tennis court and pool nestled within the upscale Sugar Hill community. The house, once available for rent at up to $3,000 per night, reflects a lifestyle of elegance and peace. Meanwhile, his Quinta do Moinho estate in Portugal, spanning 30 acres, features vineyards, 3 guest houses, and breathtaking countryside views. Though he listed the property for sale at $7 million in 2017, its deep sentimental value remains tied to decades of memories and quiet retreats. Cliff previously lived in a luxurious home in the St. George's Hill area of England before downsizing in 2006, showing his shift toward a more peaceful, less showy lifestyle. Financially, Cliff Richard's net worth is estimated between $90 to $100 million, a reflection of a 6-decade career that saw more than 260 million records sold globally. He remains the 3rd best-selling singles artist in British history, behind only the Beatles and Elvis Presley. Despite his immense wealth, Cliff has chosen to lead a modest life marked by personal discipline and spiritual reflection. His car collection, featuring a Bentley Mulsanne, a Mercedes GLS 63, and a Mazda CX-5, demonstrates his appreciation for comfort and class, without excessive display. Remarkably, Cliff continues to perform. His 2023 orchestral album, Cliff with Strings, My Kinderlife, reached the top 5 in the UK charts, proving that his voice and musical relevance endure. In 2025, he embarked on the Can't Stop Me Now tour, marking his 85th birthday with performances across the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. When asked about his secret to longevity, Cliff attributed it to regular walks and playing tennis, avoiding rigorous gym routines in favor of natural, joyful movement. He explained, "Being 80 is a surprise to me. I just keep moving." This simple philosophy has allowed him to maintain not only his health, but also his connection with audiences spanning generations. Cliff Richard's personal life remains rooted in privacy and solitude, having never married or had children. In the absence of a traditional family structure, questions about inheritance have occasionally surfaced. While details about his will remain private, it is widely assumed that his vast estate and wealth will be channeled into the charitable causes that have long defined his legacy. The Cliff Richard Charitable Trust, his personal foundation, provides grants to over 50 UK-registered charities each quarter. The trust focuses on organizations serving children, the elderly, and those involved in medical research. His charitable efforts extend to long-standing support of institutions like the Shooting Star Children's Hospices, the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation, and Alzheimer's Research UK. He is also a patron of Guitar Aid, regularly signing guitars for auction to support GL, OBLE missions, and medical outreach. There were no charges, no prior notice, No due process, just lights, lenses, and the spectacle of suspicion. For a man who had devoted over 5 decades to uplifting audiences through his music, the assault on his dignity was not just public, it was devastatingly personal. The raid was part of Operation U-Tree, a sweeping investigation into historical sexual abuse allegations in the UK sparked in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal. But Cliff Richard's case stood apart. There was no accuser named, no formal complaint ever brought before the court. And yet, his name was dragged through headlines as if guilt had already been decided. For 22 terrible months, he lived under investigation, stripped of peace, privacy, and the assumption of innocence. It was like living in a nightmare, he would later recall. I felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath me. The toll was excruciating. Cliff began to lose weight, struggled with sleeplessness, and suffered a severe outbreak of shingles, a painful reminder that stress does not just torment the mind, but punishes the body. Friends and close confidants noted that the ever-cheerful entertainer had dimmed. "They stole my joy," he admitted in a later interview. It wasn't just his public image that suffered, it was his very sense of self. In the eyes of millions, he went from beloved icon to suspected predator overnight, and no amount of silence could stop the tide of doubt. Worse still, the BBC had worked with the police in covering the raid. It wasn't just reporting the news. They had become part of the spectacle. As cameras zoomed in on Cliff's private home, capturing aerial footage and broadcasting his home address, the act crossed the line from journalism into invasion. He wasn't asked for comment. He wasn't protected by keeping his name secret. He was served up to the public as breaking news. His life reduced to a media event. But Cliff Richard, even under attack, did not retreat into bitterness. Once the Crown Prosecution Service concluded there was not enough evidence to proceed and no charges were filed, he turned his pain into action. In 2018, he filed a lawsuit against the BBC for breach of privacy and won. The court ruled that the BBC's coverage had been a serious invasion of his rights, awarding him more than £2 million in damages. It was a landmark case, not just for Cliff, but for every individual who had ever feared being falsely tried by the press. "This is not just about me," he declared after the verdict. "This is about the principle that people are innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around." That victory, however symbolic, could not fully erase the scars. Cliff later revealed that he had considered selling all his homes and leaving the UK altogether. "There were times I didn't want to live here anymore," he confessed. The sense of betrayal ran deep, not just from the media, but from a society that had so easily turned suspicion into spectacle. For nearly 2 years, he lived in limbo, unable to tour, to create, to move forward. Yet somehow, through it all, he endured, not with defiance, but with resilience. He returned to the stage. He released new music. He stood up for the voiceless, the falsely accused, the publicly humiliated. His ordeal became more than a personal battle. It became a symbol of the dangers of trial by media. In interviews since, Cliff has spoken not with rage, but with a quiet dignity. "They tried to destroy me, but I was determined not to let them win." There is something haunting about what Cliff endured, not just the injustice, but the silence he was forced to keep while the world guessed. And yet, in the echo of that silence, something powerful emerged. In one moment of reflection, he admitted, "I've had a few false alarms. I've been in love, but marriage is a big commitment, and being an artist takes up a great deal of time." His life, in the end, wasn't marked by scandal or heartbreak, but by the quiet ache of sharing stages, not homes, of holding hands in public, but never signing wedding papers. It's a kind of tragedy that doesn't scream, it whispers. And in those whispers, Cliff Richard's story becomes not just one of fame, but of unimaginable self-control, devotion, and the echo of songs sung to an empty room when the crowd is gone. If he ever loved, he loved in silence. If he ever mourned, he mourned with dignity. And if he ever longed, it was for a life he never allowed himself to live. Perhaps that's the price of being eternal. You give everything to the world and keep nothing for yourself. In a time when fame often came tied to scandal and oversharing, Cliff Richard chose a different path, a path of dignified silence. He never married, he never had children, and he never felt the need to explain himself. While the world guessed, Cliff stood firm behind a simple belief. Not every truth needs an audience. His life was his own, and in protecting it, he became one of the rare stars who kept mystery in a world that demanded confession. For decades, stubborn rumors surrounded Cliff's sexuality, whispers made louder by tabloid newspapers hungry for scandal and silence they couldn't crack. But Cliff never gave them what they wanted. Instead, he met it with measured grace. "If I was," he once said plainly, "would it matter?" In those few words lay a powerful resistance, not denial, not confirmation, but a refusal to let others define his worth or identity. It was the kind of quiet defiance only someone deeply at peace with himself could afford. Cliff's refusal to label, to conform, or to justify became, over time, a kind of statement in itself. While others explained and clarified, he chose to let his legacy speak louder than gossip. And perhaps the most lasting part of that legacy is the bond he shared with John Macalin, a former missionary from New York, who entered Cliff's life in 2001. The two became inseparable. Macalin, by Cliff's own admission, became a source of companionship, strength, and day-to-day support. He helped manage Cliff's homes, shared his travel, and more importantly, shared in his solitude. To some, their connection invited further guessing, but Cliff never took the bait. In a rare moment of reflection, he said of Macalin, "It's nice to have someone who cares about you, not because you're famous, but just because you're you." It was less a defense, and more a testament to the power of chosen family, of emotional closeness that can't be defined, and of a life lived on his own terms. In a world obsessed with who sleeps beside whom, Cliff Richard remained a fortress, not out of shame or fear, but out of a belief that some parts of the heart deserve sanctuary, not spotlight. And perhaps in choosing not to be understood, he taught us the rarest kind of courage, to be whole without being explained. Just when it seemed that Cliff Richard had weathered every storm fame could bring, when he had survived heartbreak, outlived musical eras, and reclaimed his place in the hearts of millions, an even darker cloud came down. It began with the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the still summer air. A sudden invasion that shattered the peace of Cliff Richard's private life. On that awful day in 2014, his home was swarmed by police, cameras hovering overhead, the BBC broadcasting every moment of the raid in real time. Cliff, a knighted icon of British music, a man with no prior criminal record, watched his reputation fall apart on national television, all based on an anonymous accusation. He was a living legend who still had something to say, and he wasn't done yet. In 1990, his song Saviour's Day topped the UK charts once again, proving his amazing ability to stay relevant. It wasn't about chasing trends. It was about timeless honesty, the kind that doesn't fade with fashion. What makes this part so moving is not just the comeback, but the quiet dignity with which Cliff handled the fall. He didn't lash out. He didn't beg for relevance. Instead, he returned to his roots: faith, music, and truth. That's how he rose again. Not louder, but deeper. Not faster, but stronger. His story during these years isn't just one of revival. It's a masterclass in bounce-back ability. It's a reminder that even legends can fall. But the great ones, they rise again and again. For all his dazzling success and decades under the spotlight, Cliff Richard's deepest chapters were written not on stage, but in silence, in glances that never turned into promises, in loves that slipped away, and in the haunting echo of a life lived without a lasting partner. The world saw the superstar, the eternal bachelor, but few truly understood the price he paid to keep the music alive. His heart, it seemed, always had to take second place. Perhaps no name in Cliff's personal story carries as much quiet weight as Olivia Newton-John. Their bond, lasting over 50 years, was built not on scandal or drama, but on shared harmonies and unspoken affection. Cliff once said, "I was in love with her, but she was engaged to someone else." Olivia would go on to marry Bruce Welch, Cliff's own bandmate and closest friend, yet Cliff never turned away. They continued performing together, their voices joining like old letters never sent. Their final duet in 2015, singing Suddenly, was less a performance and more a farewell whispered through music. When Olivia passed away in 2022, Cliff didn't offer a public statement full of nice words. He simply said, "She didn't die. She just stopped living." Few sentences have ever sounded more heartbreaking. But Olivia wasn't the only almost. In 1961, Cliff poured his heart into a 3-page letter to Delia Wicks, the Australian dancer he had loved for 18 months. He told her the cruel truth. "Being a pop singer, I have to give up one priceless thing: the right to any lasting relationship with any special girl." It was not just a breakup. It was a confession of sacrifice. He chose his mother, his sisters, and his calling over the possibility of personal happiness. The letter wasn't just goodbye. It was a wound that never fully healed. Then came Jackie Irving, utterly beautiful, Cliff once said. For a time, they were inseparable, and those close to him believed this was the one. But again, life, career, and fate pulled them apart. Jackie would later marry another singer, leaving Cliff once more at the edge of something that might have been. In the 1980s, the world briefly hoped love had finally found him in the form of tennis champion Sue Barker. Their relationship was public, affectionate, and genuine. Cliff even spoke of marriage, saying in a 1983 interview, "If marriage comes on the horizon, I shall welcome it." But months later, he admitted, "I didn't love her quite enough to commit the rest of my life." Sue, always gracious, once said, "We love each other, and we still do." And so the pattern continued. Love came close, looked him in the eyes, and quietly walked away. For decades, tabloid newspapers questioned his choices, whispered about his being alone. But Cliff never chased rumors, never explained himself. Instead, he let silence speak. Influenced by American preacher Billy Graham, he publicly said he was a Christian. In a music business that celebrated excess, Cliff's decision to embrace purity and purpose was almost shocking. The backlash was quick. Fans left. Shows were canceled. There were rumors he would quit music altogether. Cliff himself admitted, "There was a time I felt completely lost. I wasn't sure if I was playing a character or living a lie. But instead of giving up, he reinvented himself. His new faith didn't make his art smaller. It made it better. "I stopped performing characters," he once said. "I started performing as myself." This inner change didn't make him softer. It made his determination stronger. Cliff stayed on the music charts well into the 70s, with hits like We Don't Talk Anymore and Devil Woman, songs that mixed deep emotions with beautiful melodies. He dared to grow older gracefully in a business addicted to youth. But the journey wasn't without pain. Even at his peak, Cliff struggled with loneliness, the cost of being famous, and the pressure of being seen as the perfect star. Every time he smiled for a camera, he hid the weight of keeping a spotless image. Every time he sang about love, he carried the pain of love lost or never begun. His life wasn't one of rock star wildness, but one of disciplined devotion. To music, to faith, and to the quiet dignity of keeping promises. This part of Cliff's life shows two sides: the glamour of stage lights and the shadows they create. He wasn't just Britain's answer to Elvis. He was Britain's echo of something deeper. Not rebellion, but strength. Not fame, but faith. Not chaos, but quiet conviction. And in that, he became something rare. A star with a soul still searching and a heart still healing. Just when it seemed Cliff Richard's place in music history couldn't be shaken, the 1970s hit him with a brutal blow. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the music charts no longer played his voice. In 1975, he faced a painful dry spell. No hits, no headlines, no clear path forward. For a man whose life had been shaped by applause and adoration, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just a business dip. It was a crisis of who he was. Cliff later remembered, "There was a moment when I thought, maybe I've had my time. Maybe the curtain's falling." But the story was far from over. In 1976, Cliff released Devil Woman, a bold, haunting song that shattered expectations and soared into the top 10 of the U.S. Billboard charts, his first major breakthrough in America. The song's dark appeal and polished production showed a dramatic evolution in his artistry. Suddenly, critics who once dismissed him as a teen idol were now comparing his work to the soulful depths of Marvin Gaye. Rock legends like Elton John and Eric Clapton began to speak of Cliff with genuine respect. He wasn't chasing youth anymore. He was mastering reinvention. This time marked a rebirth. Gone were the lightweight pop songs of his early years. In their place came songs filled with deep thought, maturity, and emotional depth. The 1980s brought hits like We Don't Talk Anymore, a sad anthem that touched people of all ages. The album Always Guaranteed proved his commercial strength, while his Christmas single Mistletoe and Wine became a beloved classic, adding a new seasonal layer to his musical legacy. Then, in 1989, Cliff delivered one of the most defining moments of his career. The concert at Wembley Stadium was more than a concert. It was a celebration looking back, an emotional journey through 5 decades of music, faith, and personal growth. With thousands of fans singing along, Cliff proved he wasn't just a leftover from the past. It was rough, electric, and rebellious. It went to number 2 on the UK music charts. Suddenly, a new sound had arrived, and with it, a new face. But behind that face was still the same boy who had learned to turn pain into music and struggle into performing. These beginnings weren't an easy path to being famous. They were like walking on a tightrope between being hungry and having hope, between what he had lost and what he dreamed of becoming. And while the world would come to know Cliff Richard as a well-behaved star, an example of faith and good behavior, few people understood that he had been shaped not by fame, but by quiet hardship. He didn't become successful despite his struggles. He became successful because of them. The difference between how the public saw him and his private beginnings was truly, quietly sad. A boy shaped by loss, driven by duty, and kept going by a dream the world almost stole before it ever saw him. Long before all the excitement, before the stage name or the screaming fans, there was just Harry Webb, a quiet teenager with a used guitar and a dream that felt too big for his small life in Hertfordshire. Music wasn't an escape. It was what kept him alive. Inspired by how exciting Elvis Presley was, young Harry found himself drawn to the raw energy of American rock and roll. He formed a band with school friends, first called the Drifters, and spent countless nights practicing in garages and church halls. One day, by pure luck, their demo song Move It was heard by a music producer named Norrie Paramore at EMI Records. It was only supposed to be the less important song on the record. But when a radio DJ heard it and demanded it become the main song, everything changed. That moment, pure chance, raw talent, and perfect timing would launch Harry Webb into becoming Cliff Richard, Britain's first true rock and roll star. Fame may have come suddenly, but Cliff Richard carried it like a man still learning how to breathe underwater. From 1958 to 1963, Britain fell under what people called Cliff hysteria. Teenagers screamed, records sold like crazy, and a once awkward boy from Surrey became the face of a generation hungry for happiness. Move It, his first hit song, wasn't just popular. It was a huge change. With its rough guitar sounds and youthful confidence, it broke America's control over rock and roll and climbed to number 2 on the UK charts. The Guardian newspaper would later call it the first real British rock record. Cliff followed that success with a flood of hits. Living Doll, The Young Ones, Summer Holiday. These weren't just songs. They were theme songs of young people after the war finally claiming their own identity. Hollywood wanted him to come make movies, but he didn't need to go. British movies welcomed him. His musical comedies brought millions of people to movie theaters, turning Cliff into not just a pop star, but a name everyone knew. He was well-behaved, magnetic, and uniquely British. In a world still hurt from war, Cliff Richard offered not rebellion, but comfort wrapped in rhythm. Then came 1964. The Beatles exploded onto the world stage. For most singers of Cliff's time, it was the end. But not for him. That year alone, Cliff had 6 top 10 hits in the UK, more than the Beatles themselves. Paul McCartney and John Lennon would later admit that Cliff had paved the way for them. But instead of copying their revolutionary style, Cliff chose to stay different. He didn't chase what was popular. He made his own path. But behind all the successes, a storm was building. Not about music, but about his soul. In 1966, when he was at the height of his fame, Cliff experienced what he would later call a spiritual awakening. For more than 60 years, Sir Cliff Richard didn't just make music. He became one of the most famous singers in British history. People called him the Elvis Presley of the UK. Cliff was Britain's first real rock star, and he was their answer to a big music revolution happening around the world. He had a voice that people of all ages loved. He stayed out of trouble when other stars didn't, and he never gave up even when things got hard. He became a symbol of never quitting. He was a singer who worked really hard and always tried to do the right thing. Being famous never made him mean, and bad times never made him lose hope. What really happened to the man who once was the biggest star with such good manners and a beautiful voice? Get ready, because his story is sadder than most people ever knew. Cliff Richard's story didn't start with people clapping for him. It started with being hungry, crying at night, and a little boy watching his family's world fall apart. In 1940, in the hot and colorful city of Lucknow in British India, Harry Roger Webb was born into a world that was still ruled by Britain, but was already starting to change. His early life was full of opposites. They had servants and structure on the outside, but there was silence and worry inside their home. In 1948, when Harry was just 8 years old, India became free from Britain. The British rule was over. For his family, this meant they had to leave, not go on an adventure. They packed what little they owned and got on a ship to England. Not the pretty England you see on postcards, but a gray, rainy country after the war, trying to rebuild from all the damage. The Webb family moved into a tiny apartment in Carshalton, Surrey. They went from having servants in India to all living in one room with no heat. There were nights I watched my mother cry without making a sound, Cliff remembered later. His father, Roger, used to manage food services for a railroad company in India, but he couldn't find work in England. They had very little money, and it was hard to keep their pride. Young Harry quickly learned that smiling was like money, and staying quiet was like armor. These early years, so different from being famous, became the foundation of a strength that few people would ever see, but everyone would benefit from. At first, music wasn't something he wanted to do for a living. It was a way to escape. He heard American rock and roll on the radio, and it opened something inside him. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. These weren't just voices on the radio. They were like ropes thrown to someone drowning. They were bright colors in a gray world. Suddenly, I wanted to be on stage, he said years later. I wanted to make people feel what these singers made me feel. In school, he was shy and awkward, not the handsome star he would become, but a tall, unsure teenager who knew his family couldn't afford to send him to college, and he couldn't stand the thought of working in a factory. He started singing with friends, trying to get small jobs playing at youth clubs and church halls. One night, he borrowed his uncle's guitar. The next night, he borrowed his mother's courage. When he was 17, he changed his name to Cliff Richard, honoring Little Richard and thinking of a cliff as something strong that can't be moved. The name was more than just a new identity. It was like a shield, a promise he made to himself. Harry Webb, the boy who watched his mother cry, who shared a bed with his brothers and sisters to stay warm, was gone. In his place stood Cliff, calm, charming, and unbreakable. In 1958, Cliff and his band, then called the Drifters, recorded a song called Move It. This song would later be called the first real British rock and roll song. Cliff's dedication to giving back began as early as the 1960s, when he pledged to give 10% of his earnings to charitable causes, a commitment he has honored ever since. This sense of duty reflects a deeper spiritual calling that has guided his decisions both on and off the stage. In a world often driven by fame and fortune, Cliff Richard stands apart, a man who rose from hardship, weathered scandal, and aged with dignity, leaving behind a life rich not only in awards, but in purpose. As he continues to live, perform, and serve with grace, Sir Cliff Richard's current chapter is not merely a quiet retirement. It is an enduring crescendo of a life well lived, echoing his belief that true legacy is measured not by what we keep, but by what we give. His journey is a reminder that greatness is not a destination, but a path paved with humility, generosity, and an unwavering commitment to one's values. The boy who once gazed at Elvis Presley in wonder became a man who inspired others with his voice, his resilience, and his heart. He is a living testament to the idea that fame, when anchored in faith and compassion, can illuminate rather than consume. So as we reflect on the extraordinary legacy of Sir Cliff Richard, we ask you, what part of his life spoke to your soul? Was it the triumph over pain, the silent strength behind his smile, or the grace with which he chose solitude over spectacle? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in keeping his story alive. If you were touched by this tribute, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the world needs to remember that even legends are human, and that humanity is what makes them legendary.